Good morning, everyone from New York, and good afternoon to Austria. My name is Daniel Sawaczynski. I'm the Austrian Deputy Trade Commissioner here in New York City, and I would like to welcome you to our very first webinar of the new year. It is easy to say that it has been quite an eventful year here in the United States already, with a storm at the Capitol on the 6th of January, with a thankfully peaceful inauguration of the 46th President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, the Super Bowl last weekend, and the ongoing impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump. It has been quite an exciting year. All of this amidst an ongoing economic crisis, an ongoing health crisis, a pandemic that's still raging through the country and the world, obviously. So when we thought about how to start this year, how to start this event year with all of you, we thought that the perfect topic is to look back on one hand to what has really impacted us in the past year, what has changed our lives, our work, our everydays, but also look forward to this next year, and beyond. The pandemic is going into a new phase, or has started going into a new phase, with the vaccinations being rolled out. In the US, already 43 million vaccines have been administered, with roughly 1.4 million doses being administered every day. So we thought it really the perfect timing right now to look ahead what changed last year and what consequences those changes from last year will bring to us as employees, as customers, simply as people in our everyday lives. And so when we read into the FJORD Trends 2021, we thought this is the perfect match, this is the perfect combination. So I'm very, very happy to introduce our speakers of today, Martha Cotton and Thomas Müller. Martha is based in Chicago. Hi, Martha. She is the managing director of Accenture and also a global co-lead of FJORD. And Thomas is based in Germany, out of Germany. He is a global design lead strategy for Accenture Interactive. And it's great to have you with us, and it's great to dive into what's awaiting for us in the next year. Before I give you the word, just a quick household rules, what's going to happen in the next hour. So this webinar is being recorded. So you will receive the recording in the next few days in case you can't stay for the whole session. We will go into Q&A at the end of the session. So you have two ways to ask your questions. Please do so. There is a questions field in the GoToWebinar app. And you can also raise your hand and ask your questions directly in the Q&A session at the end. So we will unmute you and give you the word. And last but not least, we are having this webinar in English because we also invited a few of our local representatives of Austrian subsidiaries. And of course, Martha is being with us. And so it should have been as inclusive as possible event for both Austrians and our US representatives. So thank you so much, Martin and Thomas, for being with us. And I'd like to hand over to you. And when we would like to start, maybe Thomas, you could give us a short introduction. What's the connection between FJORD, Accenture Interactive, Accenture, how this all links together, and how are those trends born?
Excellent. Thank you, Grüß Gott aus Berlin. Thank you very much for having both myself, Thomas Müller, and my colleague Martha with us to answer that question and give you a bit of a context, because I assume many of you know and have heard of Accenture. I'm just going to say a few words up front about Accenture. So our collective focus at Accenture Interactive is what we call the business of experience. And when it comes to experience, customer experience or experience broadly, we see it as sort of like the intersection of purpose and innovation to grow people, society, industries, and business in itself. The best work that we believe happens is when it has human purpose at its core. And for us, that purpose is all about designing, building, and then really enabling transformative experiences that improve at the end of the day, be it through governments or businesses, human lives. And to achieve Accenture's broader purpose, which is about delivering on technology and human ingenuity, we embrace that humanity. We're really fascinated by how human connections happen, how they feel, and why they are so meaningful and motivating. And we are at our best when we apply our craft to the human connection, to the entirety of the front stage of the experience, also often known for many of you as the front office and beyond, and doing that really with speed, scale, intelligent technologies to create ultimately value for your clients and for humans at large. Now, we do that in the context that today people all around the world experience brands in very new ways. And the last 12 months of the pandemic have only accelerated that change. And what adds to that is that consumers out there have what we all have spoken about for years, liquid expectations, which they carry from one brand to the next. For example, public service organizations are being held to the same standards today as retail brands, and healthcare companies find themselves competing with technology companies. So digital experience has made consumers entirely industry agnostic in their expectations. And as these numbers that you see on the screen here show, experience is everything, but too many organizations are out of sync. They're either too rigid or moving at a pace that is slower than their consumers change. And our trends help point out what is happening with people, and what are the things that you need to look out for over the next 12 to 18 months. Now, when you execute customer experience well, it still yields very, very good results. More customers, better sales, better loyalty. Its importance isn't going away, but the value proposition of customer experience is stalling. And some of the most recent Forrester research shows somewhat diminishing results from the customer experience momentum. We are seeing a lot of work is trending towards a sea of sameness. On the other hand, our own research shows that the fundamental premises that we believe is that there needs to be an evolution away from the way customer experience is typically implemented today. In the future, we believe experience is no longer the remit of just one person or one function. It's the organization as a whole coming together around a common cause. Great experiences that is defined not by what you offer, but by how you enable your customers to achieve the outcomes most important to them. So that's our focus as Accenture Interactive. FJORD is the design and innovation team of Accenture Interactive, has been with the firm and that team since 2013 with more than 1,500 designers around 35 studios across the world. In Germany, soon opening up in Vienna as well. And this is a perfect point in time to hand over and introduce Martha Copton, who is the global co-lead of FJORD, and also one of the principal thinkers and authors of Trends. Over to you, Martha.
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, actually, the trends work, it's honestly my most favorite part of my job. I find it fascinating, but it's also just an amazing time because of the way that we develop the trends. And I'll spend a minute just explaining kind of how we pull our trends report together annually and before we dig into what they are. As Thomas mentioned, we're about 1,500 designers, literally in every corner of the globe. And the way we establish our trends is the summer of the year that before the report is out. We crowdsource the evidence that people are seeing from around the world. We engage every single one of our designers around the world and ask them to send us the signals that they're seeing that they think, start to portend what is happening. So our trends are truly global. And the interesting thing about the trends report is it really is looking at humanity and how people are engaging with technology and digital, and not the other way around. So these are not intended to be tech trends. These are really about how people are behaving and what that means for, as Thomas said, the products and services we need to be thinking about as we evolve over the next 12 to 18 months. This is the 14th year that we've published a trends report, and we're actually, it was, as mentioned by Daniel and Thomas, it's been a remarkable 12 months. When we published our 2020 trends, I don't think we could have imagined what the year had in store for all of us. And it's really hard to separate the global pandemic and what we all have collectively endured as a global community of humans. And so you'll see that the pandemic plays a role in how we characterize our trends, but these are really trends that look inclusive of how we've collectively shifted as a global community, but also what we think this means beyond. So what will change about our behavior as we hopefully soon emerge from this experience. One other quick comment before we dig into the 7 trends, and there are 7, you're seeing them now, is that another thing we look at each year, once we kind of get all this wonderful evidence from our colleagues around the world, is we start to see what we call a meta trend. So this is essentially a theme that connects all of our trends in a compelling way. Now, interestingly, our theme for the 2020 trends, which we published a little over a year ago, was that we thought that it was an opportunity for businesses to fundamentally realign all of the fundamentals, literally everything you think about. Little did we know what the year would actually be like, and we feel like 2020 has only reinforced this moment of reinvention. Our theme for 2021 is what we call mapping out new territories. What we found ourselves in is essentially a moment in time where there's a lot that's uncertain for sure, and there's a tremendous amount that's unknown. So we're standing in a map that is yet to be drawn, and it's our opportunity, honestly, to create the new map. Now this is scary, but it's also a huge opportunity for all of us collectively to redraw the map, create the directions that we want to go in, and start to continually uncover the route that lies ahead for us. So bear that meta theme in mind as we go through the trends, mapping out new territories. And I'm going to turn it back to Thomas to lead us through our first one, collective displacement.
Excellent, thank you. So collective displacement, trend 1. So 2020, the year that we've just all, managed through, literally how and where we experience things has dramatically changed, leaving us all in any corner of the world feeling very, very disconnected from familiar comforts, from the familiar context that we all were used to, both big and small. And that goes across a range of dimensions. Place, we've seen in many parts of the world a dramatic shift from life in city to life in the countryside, and the rippling effects that had on especially city real estate prices, which is an obvious one, but there are others, more subtle. All of the businesses that were just associated with the everyday commute, if you're coming from an outer borough or an outer Kiez in Berlin into the city, and you buy your lunch or you have your morning breakfast. A lot of these places have been severely impacted. The activities that were a part of our life, they've moved a lot from in real time to online. This event, probably would have happened in New York City, my hometown of 20 years. Many of you are probably there. We've shifted the world to online, be it lectures, be it business conventions like this one, or yoga or cycling. It turns out, this may have shown us new ways to be with surprising experience gains as well as losses. Community, the way people gather has dramatically changed, from doing things together to doing things in smaller groups, in smaller parts, or entirely alone. The weekly congregation in a church for many has nearly evaporated and is only in small pockets coming back. Or think of be it American football or European football that routine of going to your stadium and celebrating with your team and in North America before you go into the stadium, all of that has completely changed. But then most dramatically, this theme of a loss of agency over our choices. We have lost temporarily a lot of control, and I think the word lockdown says it all. So our patterns of movement have changed, and that has dramatically impacted brands and the visibility of their brands. If we're no longer in transit, or the transit is significantly reduced, how will consumers get the signals, have the information, make the choices, and conversely, how will brands reach effectively their potential customers, the regular customers in the real world, when on top of it, virtually, we also have started to see, technology-driven disruption moving in as ad tracking approaches are really starting to also become present in iOS or Android. So within this context, brands really have to question everything they thought they knew about their customers and understand the shifts in their behavior to be prepared for the long term. How do you deliver a brand experience at a distance when you have, loss of proximity? A fantastic example that we love is how many marathons around the world were completely canceled, but the London Marathon managed to stage an experience, and a quite fantastic experience. 43,000 runners participated virtually. How people gather information and discover when the journey to work, as I was describing earlier, has been significantly reduced or shifted. How we shop when we don't go out, when the access to supermarkets has been turned upside down, and instead it's become much more of a continuous stream at micro moments to shop. And how do brands create joy, fun, real deep brand engagement through immersive experiences that go beyond just streaming content or presentations? Within that context, this slide is an important one for you to remember. You'll see the same pattern after every trend. There's three things that we point out: what a brand absolutely should begin to think about, what it should be prepared to say, so what are you going to communicate, or what kind of actions you also could activate. We think the one to point out in this trend is businesses have a role really to play in giving people hope. We're leaving the pandemic years behind us. There is light. So the tone of voice that you select in your outreach, the way you interact and the way we speak and communicate with your customers is extremely important. With that, back to Martha.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm hoping everyone on the call can really relate to the notion of collective experience. I'm not hoping you felt displaced, but I would imagine that many of us have had that. Thomas, you mentioned the commute and what's lost in the commute. I mean, little did I ever imagine that the displacement of my own commute would feel a loss to me. I didn't realize how much I relied on that as sort of a time to mentally prepare for the workday ahead. And now I don't have that. The way that I do that has been displaced. So it's been kind of a personal discovery of mine that I actually miss that time that I used to grumble about. The next trend is do-it-yourself innovation, and it's interesting because in a time of displacement, and again, as sort of traumatic as that can really feel to people, what has also been inspiring is that human ingenuity has risen in response to the challenge that comes from collective displacement. So I think, as Thomas and I are in the design field, and we all know that design loves constraints, and this has been a time of profound constraint. So we're seeing people be creative in really amazing ways. This has really ushered in a trend that we think has been growing for a while, but innovation moving from the idea of device first to people first, where people take the constraints as a catalyst for their creativity. So we've seen things like life hacks for a long time. This is where people, kind of hack technology products and services to work better in their lives. We've seen some really interesting life hacks. A colleague of ours who hacked an ironing board at the beginning of the lockdown to use as her stand-up desk. But what we're seeing here is almost like a radical repurposing of entire platforms to work better for people's own experiences. So think of people thinking of platforms almost as an unpainted canvas upon which they can finish the service itself and repurpose it to serve their own needs. And this is exciting, partly because it kind of drives the relevance of products and services to people, but also it really enhances the efficiency of innovation itself. But think of it, if you think of the end user, the consumer, as the finisher of your product or service, think of how much more rapidly we can push innovation. There's been some really interesting examples of this in Lebanon, for example, post-lockdown in the wake of Beirut's devastating port explosion. Many schools in Lebanon turned to WhatsApp for an informal learning program. On the entertainment side, Travis Scott, who's a big entertainer, turned to Fortnite to use as a virtual concert venue. Again, Fortnite actually being a gaming platform, repurposed to connect with fans and offer a concert. So one of the things I really do love about this trend is that it blurs the line here between creator and customer. And I don't know if people on the call are familiar with co-creation methods. This is something that Thomas and I use all the time. The idea of essentially bringing the end user into the design process so that we design products and services that will feel meaningful and relevant. So what has happened here is just an explosion of co-creation, and thinking of it as much as an output to products and services and innovation as an input. So what we really think that some of the takeaways here are, companies, for them to succeed, you really need to think of your products and services as suggestive of use rather than prescriptive, and start designing tools and platforms that enable people to create for themselves and shape technology around their goals. Release these products and services into the world and let the end consumer, finish them almost. And so another key takeaway I want to hit on this slide is, yes, think of your customers as co-creators, but also think of it as this idea of accelerating the development cycle. Innovation isn't just about ideas, it is about having courage and fortitude to see new ideas through to the market. Think about time and stamina is so crucial to innovation success, but this idea of do-it-yourself of innovation can only focus on people's creativity and create tremendous efficiency. One last, again, sort of a personal story before I move on to the next trend. My 16-year-old daughter just showed me a new musical for Ratatouille, which was a big, very popular animation a few years ago. It has been entirely written and choreographed through crowdsourced TikTok users and pulled together over just a few months, and then recorded by famous Broadway and other stars. It would normally take years to create a new musical. And here we have this entirely crowdsourced, very fun expression of creativity using TikTok as the platform for a Broadway musical. So a great example of do-it-yourself innovation. So I'll move on to the next trend. Sweet teams are made of this. And this is a kind of our employee experience and employer trend. One of the things we do increasingly at FJORD and Accenture Interactive is think about, employees are people too, like big shocker there, but we could design employee experiences. Well, what has happened in the last 12 months is a wholesale change in the reciprocal employment agreement between employer and employee. And this has manifested itself in a lot of really interesting ways. Much of the peripheral value of work has been lost for people. So think about a new employee, a new college graduate get on his or her first job starting last year. She is not meeting her peers. She's not having casual conversations in the hallway. She's not forming networks in the way that actually helps to advance the career. She's not learning basic how-tos from the older colleague. Think about for yourselves the serendipitous exchange that you might have with a coworker in the cafeteria or break room. Think about that, the loss of the periphery of work. And again, it's just kind of less fun, I think, around work. Another manifestation of this trend is that many of the costs previously covered by the employer has entirely shifted to the employee. Think of the desk, the heating we need, the broadband costs, the free coffee that maybe you are used to. I personally, just 2 weeks ago, finally purchased a chair that is an office chair. I've been sitting in a chair not intended for long-term 10, 12 hours sitting for 10 months before I finally caved and said, you know what, let's make this so slightly more ergonomic for me. So working from home, as I think many of us have experienced, has become living in your office with family and childcare at the core of it. Now, we do think, and there's a lot of questions about what does this mean for workplace and environment. We don't think workplace is dead, but we do think what it is a mindset more often than not, supported by technology. And I think it's probably many people on this call, Thomas and myself for sure, are aware we are definitely lacking the hardware, the software to really support this new mindset of workplace. We don't think the future will be one size fits all. This is an interesting opportunity to really rethink what workplace means and sort of this interplay between the worker, kind of their own contradictory views on what's next, a worker who may want to be desperately eager to go back to work, or actually finds a lot of benefit from working from home more often than they would have before. Employers have very differing perspectives here. Reed Hastings of Netflix sees this what has happened as a creative disaster, but there's many CFOs have been really keen to take advantage of a once in a company lifetime opportunity to save on overhead costs. There's also governments are concerned about what is happening here because of think of this as Thomas mentioned in collective displacement, city centers emptying out and the social and economic impact of these hollowed out city centers. There's a lot of pressure for businesses to go back to work, which means that, again, we're not just talking about office workers in this trend. We are talking about the entire ecosystem of jobs that could be done remotely, and or the jobs that are reliant on those urban office hubs, dry cleaners, pharmacists, bars, restaurants, even mass transit workers that have been impacted. So we do think that there's an interesting opportunity for employers to iterate around 4 areas. Technology, again, thinking of the new hardware and software that will support this mindset of workplace. Let's make it meet the needs that actually help us support long-term remote working. Think about the value of the periphery. Is there a way that we can actually support that in a remote context? It's a hard challenge, but definitely a worthwhile endeavor. There's an opportunity to innovate around culture. Employees need to build this sense of belonging for who we are when we are physically apart. This is something Thomas and I think about practically every day as we try to kind of galvanize our teams and help us feel connected. Face-to-face is a premium, but what can we do to innovate to make culture actually mean something in these remote contexts? Certainly there's an opportunity to innovate how we think about talent, how we think about recruiting, how we reward talent. With remote working, honestly, recruiters can now throw the net much wider. This idea could actually be really a wonderful boon to many companies' inclusion and diversity initiatives. Candidates themselves can be choosier about who they want to work with, knowing that they can pretty much work from anywhere. This does lead to a reassessment of the value and rewarding of talent. Silicon Valley companies, for example, are offering the opportunity to work anywhere. However, workers need to accept that their salary may reduce in line with the changes to their cost of living. And the last what area to innovate around is control. How best to control sort of this whole workplace mindset mentality, when it's appropriate to do so. There's a lot of ethical considerations here. So sales of surveillance software to check on home workers and what they're doing. Staff cop, there's a always on webcam video monitor called Sneak, which is kind of an unfortunate name. But these services have boomed during lockdown. So thinking about the ethics here is going to be really important. So we do think some things to bear in mind is we are entering an area of prototyping here. Take a page out of the designer's book and experiment and prototype on what the future of work can look like, and start to think about charting those new territories. I'm going to turn it back to Thomas to talk about our next trend.
Excellent. Thank you, Martha. So the next one is called Interaction Wanderlust. I'm going to intentionally pronounce that in German. And really at the heart of that, this one is about how to bring joy and serendipity that we were so used to in the real world to these windows to the world, these screens, these rectangles in various sizes that we have been forced to. And it really ultimately, this trend builds on how people work, how we collaborate, how we communicate with each other, because that is at the heart of who we are. It's a big, overwhelming aspect of our lives. And even before the pandemic, we already started in many professions, spend a significant amount of time with screens as part of our daily jobs. But then you look at the last 10 months, screens really have become our windows to the world. The interactions increasingly have become dull. I hope the two of us are a breeze of fresh air and go nicely along your double espresso this morning, because there's a sea of sameness. There's a monotony that has become exhausting. The kind of joy and serendipity of your morning commute, the walk to the coffee shop, or that conversation in the hallway, it has entirely become lost. And the importance of the periphery we described in the previous trend is entirely missing in our actions. So there's been a convergence between design, content, and audiences as our screens have become much more both a window and a stage. Many of us, when the software enables it, have purposefully designed the stage upon which we perform or share trends or share other interactions. The ubiquitous joke of I'm wearing a sweater about the future, but what am I wearing below? Is it sweatpants? Has become absolutely part of the reality in which people work. The effort that people have gone into creating backgrounds, depending on the rooms that they're working from out of their home, has also really become part of creating variety and joy. So with the falling cost on one side of the spectrum, but the rising quality of cameras and editing tools, professional and amateur content producing has become really meeting in the middle and influencing each other. I mean, we've seen this even in mainstream television. In the US, late night host and comic Seth Meyers, like many in his field, from one day to the next, the show had to go on, but it was no longer on 10th Avenue in the broadcasting studio. It was in his basement starting last March. So he was helped by Australian YouTube personality Matt Parker, who'd already perfected how to create high quality content from his home, and he got great tips for how to be better at producing content made in your home. So design for screens has been very much dominated and influenced in a way by the constraints, which in this case are the operating systems, for the past 25 years. And if you didn't really, push the boxes, it's restricting creativity and leading to, overuse and commoditization of how content is presented, how templates have become just main part of the way we have been trained to create or used to seeing things, and really limiting our expectations for how we actually should reframe and question how experiences should happen online. The joy we feel when we interact with humans in the real world, it has dulled, and with 2020 mostly limiting us to the screens at home, you know, that peripheral vision has been lost. And as Martha said earlier, you know, something for some of us, it's been something that we didn't even know we needed so much. So to address this, there is a huge rise of experimentation around how people are using gaming platforms, social platforms, and mixed reality environments really as a stage for content that maybe originally wasn't intended in there, and for audience participation. Now, the new president, Joe Biden, and US representative from New York's 14th congressional district, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they used Animal Crossing during the late stages of the election to meet voters, engage with them, talk with decided voters, and especially interact, you know, with undecided voters, and make house calls to players' virtual islands. We've also seen a 40% rise in the use of Discord. Discord is traditionally a platform for gamers, for clubs and art communities, or just group of friends to connect. But it has gone way beyond that. As a matter of fact, when Accenture Interactive gathered those 1,500 designers around the world late last year for our annual community event, which had to be conducted online, Discord became one element to introduce or reintroduce interaction wanderlust, to really bring serendipity for meeting people in a new format, you know, back to this event. Clubhouse certainly is one example that has intentionally really focused on how do we get away from screens and reintroduce conversation in an unstructured and structured format to break that sea of sameness. So in this trend, you know, if I were to point out one thing, it is probably our advice around what brands and companies could start to do. It is a call to action really to, you know, find ways to recreate offline emotions in an online context, to innovate by redesigning how you can engage and have the audience participate and draw it into an experience as viewers, as active participants, or as actually creators or co-creators. I'll mention last example, personal story. You know, I'm a big cyclist in these days. During the pandemic, and now with -12 degrees Celsius here in Berlin, you find yourself a lot cycling indoors on a platform, you know, called Swift. But you combine Swift and Zoom, you cycle in a virtual world, but at the same time, you're also interacting in a real-time, you know, video conversation with your fellow cyclists. So a new format, and hacking in a way the tools out there to participate, but also to co-create a new narrative amongst each other. Back to Martha.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, our next trend is called liquid infrastructure. And this is very much the flip side of collective displacement. So in collective displacement, we talked about how we get things and have changed, you know, how we shop and learn, etc. In liquid infrastructure, we show how this has forced businesses to reshape how they manufacture, ship, store, and deliver. So our liquid expectations, which is kind of as Thomas mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, this idea that, you know, everyone competes about everyone else, against everyone else. And, you know, public services, you might have the same expectation for an experience you had ordering food online. So these liquid expectations have actually now extended to the delivery and unboxing experience, which is for most brands entirely outside of your ecosystem. So this has implications for everything that happens before that moment. Now we know that the cost to serve has risen dramatically for several reasons. There's been a loss of incidental spending, typically found from impulse buys in store, for example. We know that retail has had, and many sort of service industries have had health and sanitary costs as physical retailers, and others have had to adjust to make those who do venture inside feel safe. There's been volume efficiencies of the idea of shop as people now anatomize their shopping across numerous online retailers and across time throughout the day. And then, of course, there's been a massive increase in returns, which due to the increase of online shopping, which has also increased the cost to serve. Now, many in the era of liquid infrastructure here have played with direct-to-customer models. And this has had some success, but it has proven really difficult to scale. We know that home delivery is costly. Customers themselves, consumers, don't necessarily want to manage one-to-one relationships with all these brands with which they engage. But there's been some really interesting mainstream staples like Kraft Heinz and PepsiCo that have done and experimented with direct-to-consumer models with some success. So we do think here, though, that as we examine this new closeness to customer, we used to talk a lot about the last mile as sort of an opportunity for branded experience. Now it's really the last 6 feet. And what brands need to really rethink is the trade-off there between experience and cost, and design for this last 6 feet of experience, which is essentially unbranded and can be very underwhelming, sort of the soggy box that might be left outside your door, and really thinking about, this trade-off, and does delight or efficiency matter more? So we do think that in this era of liquid infrastructure, and again, think about sort of the consumer is kind of at the center of their own supply chain ecosystem, if you will. Brands really do need to think about the position of their supply chain, expand the idea of what your assets are for, and many companies have done some interesting things here. Barclays Bank, for example, now expects their physical branches soon to be mainly used for call center workers and investment banking. Another sort of wrinkled curveball to throw in here is that as we've noticed in trends over the years, consumers are increasingly scrutinizing brands they engage with for the health to the planet. And so they're looking not just at the products itself that they buy, but they're looking for where things come from, how it gets to them, or the store that they shop in. And so this has been only increasing. There's been some interesting responses here. IKEA recently opened its first secondhand shopping center. And so there's been responses, but we do think that in the era of liquid infrastructure, thinking about the notion of local sustainable alternatives is going to be something that consumers increasingly scrutinize the brands and the products and services they engage with for. So that's just another consideration to have as you think about your liquid infrastructure. So we do think a couple of takeaways here is just again, think of your supply chain and physical assets as growth, not just efficiency. Think about offering the delight there, and what we can offer, in physical and digital as we meet the needs that are present in this era of liquid infrastructure. I'm going to hand back to Thomas for our last 2 trends.
Excellent. We're going to bring that to the finish line. So this next one is called Empathy Challenge, and this trend really at the heart of it addresses the challenge with empathy we have now. And many of the stories we and organizations tell each other about ourselves as humans and as societies with systems that were, sometimes purposefully, but certainly for too long designed unequally. And when you think about it, there's so much, maybe too much, to feel empathy for as we enter the 21st century. And in a world where expectations are extremely high, and at the same time, constant scrutiny surrounding these expectations, the challenge really is to make the empathy that we have for each other and that brands declare publicly be meaningful, not just empty words or empty statements, but truly be meaningful. 2020 certainly was a year where the awareness and the concern that people have about inequalities that exist in so many places around the world and in all of their forms, they really, that awareness grew rapidly. And then you add to it the global pandemic, and it just all accelerated. And in addition to that, it created new inequalities. One, very, very obvious and prominent example has been that women were 3 times more likely than men not to work during the pandemic because of childcare and because of very difficult and often systematically designed, approaches where childcare needs weren't easily handled, and that it was the woman, the wife, the mother of a family that ultimately had to address childcare. So, in addition to that, we saw other inequalities rise based on who has access to bandwidth, how much bandwidth do they have, who has access to healthcare, work, what is the approach to, what access does a family have to schooling when everything locks down, and the inequalities only got further accentuated. It poses a huge challenge for organizations, which they try to respond, but it's also really, really important, the narrative that you create and the narrative that you use in order to address these challenges. In our FJORD trend, Martha mentioned it earlier, last year, 2020, we identified there was a growing tension between organizations, between profit and purpose. So is everything that you are doing solely focused on maximizing shareholder profit, or does the organization have above and beyond a purpose that goes along with profit? And we've seen a rise in organizations taking really a purpose-led approach. The empathy challenge trend, in this trend, this has only become even more intense as companies now, you have to figure out how you want to handle polarizing narratives, as we've certainly seen in North America with the Black Lives Matter movement, and how to align your purpose with these narratives, often polarizing, and then which side of the narrative you as a brand, you as an organization, or as a business leader, if any position, you choose to support, because at the same time, staying completely silent is also not a choice. And there's plenty of examples that we've seen over the last year. I'll pick out 2. September of 2020, Yelp's decision to warn users about businesses accused of racism sparked, strong debate online. And then also last summer, for those of you who are foodies, Bon Appetit magazine, they published a statement on their website in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was one part of their narrative, but at the same time, it resulted in an immediate reckoning that they had to do with themselves, because many current and former employees pointed out the hypocrisy in this position and started to share, their own personal stories around systemic racism at the magazine. All of that ultimately led to the editor-in-chief to have he chose to resign. Now, it's impossible to talk about empathy for a business without mentioning the role it has in design. Empathy, again, as Martha mentioned earlier, is something that as designers, it has been for a long time been fundamental to what we do and what usually results in good design. But over the years, with the rise of design thinking, empathy in itself has been made to seem like something that you can just easily tick off a list, and that's not the case. Good design comes from a very inclusive and empathy-driven approach to really walk in, in people's shoes that you design with and that you design for. Understanding both their minds and their hearts, how they think, how they feel, makes for better products. So one thing as a takeaway from this trend is stories have always mattered. Stories are central and core to humanity. They have to become part of a brand's image nowadays too, and effectively managing these stories is crucial. And it's crucial that the narrative is matched by actions and is matched by the things you do. What you say needs to be matched with what a brand also does. Now that brings us to our final trend, the seventh trend. Hard to choose this year, but I think it is nearly one of my personal favorites aside from Interaction Wanderlust. This one is called Rituals Lost, things that we have lost over the last year, but many new rituals that also have been created and that we have found as we've gone through the last 12 months. Rituals, both big and small, you know, they define who we are. They provide a framework to life, and often they have a strong sentimental significance. They can be deeply human rituals. They can help us deal with loss, routines, sentiments. Some are big, a wedding, some are small, that daily cup of flat white or espresso. The loss of rituals is something that we share as humanity in 2020. With that loss, we've seen a big rise and a pivot towards more focus on modern spirituality and on mindfulness as a coping strategy. How do I get through the fact that so much around us has changed? It's also been a period really for reassessment and searching for new meaning that has inspired many people to develop new rituals. Family quiz night, in either a very reintroducing the notion of the nucleus family, or facilitated virtually. Karaoke night. In our home, you know, we've created an area of the house that is literally now the cycling studio. It's got the smart trainer, but it's also connected again virtually to a platform called Swift, and it allows you to cope and also you know, be mindful and take care of your body. Brands have an opportunity to really step into this lost rituals and found rituals context and help people to regain a sense of control and empowerment and to reconnect and heal. In the US, again, 75% of consumers tried different brands, tried different stores where possible during the pandemic, and 60% of those expect to integrate those new brands who have understood how they can, you know, provide hope, can provide meaning in that gap in their post-pandemic life. So what can you as a brand do in this context? First thing is ask if your brand is part of a habit or a ritual. Understanding that blank space left by a lost ritual and then designing an appropriate experience that really can replace it can be key. And some of the guiding questions here can be: ask yourself if your brand can act as a portal between the different selves of people. Ask your brand if you can provide a sense of belonging. A wonderful example there is Mars made variety bags for Zoom costume parties during Halloween and scary home movie nights. Ask if your brand also can be a source of control. Me and we time, very relevant again to wellness. Peloton might be another example that comes to mind here. And then lastly, can your brand be an anchor? The big moments that are shared with others. One of our favorite examples here is a wedding website that we've come across, shadi.com, created a new weddings from home experience, seeking to bring as many of the moments that are really precious when families celebrate or used to celebrate a wedding in the real world, and transporting them to an in-person event to a virtual wedding. Some rituals lost, quite many new found. So again, last piece of advice here is key is to encourage rituals to transition from lost to found and helping people feel more relevant and providing, meaning and embracing new sources of joy. That was a breeze through our 7 trends by the fantastic Martha and myself. Here's again the overview. We've got a few minutes left. I want to just show you this slide as well. For those of you who are in Austria or are looking for an Austrian connection, of course, you can reach out to many of us, but then there's also my dear colleague, Markus Höfinger, who is our Accenture Interactive lead in Austria. With that, over to Daniel. Let me just manage my presentation.
Fantastic,
here.
Thomas. Thank you so much, Martha, Thomas. That was really, really inspiring, and I think this is really what we aimed for. I mean, we as Austrian Trade Commission, we do a lot of future and technology-oriented webinars and formats, but we also do a bunch of webinars and formats that are about, the update on the recent taxes or visa immigration, and this is more the hardcore stuff and the technical stuff. But today, I think we really started this event year for us with a very inspirational approach. And I think what I really love and what really got me hooked on the FJORD design trends or FJORD trends was that it's very people-centric. It's really about everything there comes down to people, to being empathic, to being close to your customers, closer to your employees, really putting yourself into what they are going through, really reevaluating, where you stand as a company, as a business. And one thing that I tried to formulate as a question is a lot of Austrian companies are more in the B2B sector. So when you look at exports from Austria, worldwide, basically a lot of our machineries are suppliers or B2B suppliers. And I think how can you translate some of the main lessons? How can you translate that empathy for B2B suppliers? Does it equally count, or is it more about customer brands?
I'd like to think, we definitely do a lot of work in the B2B context as well. From my perspective, and I am an anthropologist, so I have a clear bias. From my perspective, at the end of any interaction, it's people. We're still talking about people. So your customers in a B2B context are humans who show up in all of the ways that we've described as stakeholders, as consumers, as citizens, as as people that are seeking relevance and and meaning in their interactions. So I do think that that it still applies, and so I think the lessons, especially around the meta theme, I think mapping out these new territories, it still definitely applies to the B2B. I don't know, Thomas, if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, I would add to that, specifically out of these 7 trends, if I think about how you deal with your partners, how trade events have changed dramatically. Sweet teams are made of these, how the workplace has changed, and some of the points that Martha drew out there is critical, as well as our observations backed up by the evidence, which you can find in the full report that you can download on the Accenture website in liquid infrastructure, both how supply chains have been impacted, how not just the last mile, but the last few inches have become so critical in this world that we have created overnight in the last 12 months. Those two trends are in particular quite relevant, and a lot of the B2B conversations over the last month and a half have shown great interest in those two.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, great. I also think that, and I think part of today's lessons learned for me is that also every company, even if they are a very third tier even supplier, they can add value to the brand to the customer brand. They should also be aware of who is at the end of the value chain. And I think a fantastic example is Lenzing, the Austrian company Lenzing, that is producing fibers. and they are working hard to produce sustainable fibers. And I think, you know, they are early on in the supply chain. But still they contribute to the ultimate value of the products by making them, you know, adding the sustainability brand by creating already sustainable fibers. So I think that's a great example of how companies, even in a lower tier, can absolutely add to the brand value and to the yeah. We got another question, which is that a lot of the trends, they do depend on a technology base, a functional technology. So do you believe that developing countries, or which role will developing countries play, or will they be left behind by some of the developments?
I mean, I'll point out I'll reference again the example that Martha has mentioned earlier. What happened, not necessarily prompted by the pandemic, even though the pandemic was already with us, but by the port explosion in Beirut, and you know, instantaneously, families and teachers and students repurposed, not really hacked, repurposed WhatsApp as a platform. I'll also point to, you know, a decade ago, many banks and countries, especially on the African continent, leapfrogged the kind of banking systems and solutions that we all had built and had, you know, a much harder time to move forward into the mobile context. And we also have colleagues in South Africa from which they work across the African continent, are observing and paying close attention to both at the speed at which innovations are driven, for example, on the African continent, when it comes to telecommunications, when it comes to banking, and what markets in other parts of the world, Europe, North America, can learn from, you know, that's just my example right now, banking on the African continent. Martha, anything else that comes to mind?
No, I think you covered it. I do think we're, especially with the advent of and the growth of mobile, and seeing a ton of innovation, as Thomas mentioned, sort of leapfrogging, using the constraints, you know, within these communities. I think we're seeing some interesting things. So I do think it's applicable.
Right. Maybe last question. We are a little bit over the time, but very last question. Another positive outlook. So, what do you think are the top 3 industries and opportunities for maybe let's focus a little bit on the US. What do you think are the opportunities for European companies that came out of the crisis from last year for the future?
Martha, being in the US, do you want to take the first step?
Oh, in the US, I mean, I do think, well, to me, you know, we closed with the last trend around rituals lost and found. I think, and I think I'm seeing a lot of retailers and entertainment companies really be innovative in how they can be part of new rituals. So I think there's a lot around just generally those service industries. Yeah, so to me, those are some exciting things that are happening there.
Yeah, I think the other theme, even though it seems still so far away, that I would point out is those who really reinvent what travel experiences look like, are going to have a leg up on their competition, and then also you know, consumer products that are you know, focused on a niche market, or health and well-being experiences. And then the last example that I'll throw in there, I'm seeing that across Europe and in North America. I spent personally a lot of time in the insurance and at the convergence of insurance and health. Anything that has to do with telehealth, telemedicine in that field. I think we've seen a steady trend of VC money going into those sectors, and the pandemic only, put into spotlight how we can provide better healthcare solutions, not just at a lower cost, but also at to places where we previously had a hard time providing services to, and that only got accelerated during the pandemic. So telehealth, telemedicine, and generally a wider access to well-being is a sector that I think Europeans should pay a lot of attention to. There is a lot of activity in the US.
I think that's a great wrap. I think we are already, stretched our time a little bit, and you already mentioned in the beginning that there is a webinar and online meeting fatigue sometimes coming in, and we don't want to stretch the attention span of our audience too much. But it was fantastic having you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our audiences. I would like to use the last minute to go through a few things that we are planning and what you can expect from us. So we have another webinar next week talking about webinar fatigue, but it is an irrelevant topic. It is the topic of new visa and travel restrictions, what changed, what happened, what will come up with the Biden administration. It will take place on February 18th, on Thursday, on 11:30 Eastern Standard Time, Central European Time. And in general, I would like to mention also things that we do in the innovation and startup sector. So we have a few startup landing zones, which means that if you are a startup interested in the US business, there is a landing zone program, an extended landing zone program here in New York City, also in Silicon Valley, that's been going on for a long time. But also we are working on a health tech landing zone program in Boston. It also took already place successfully. In general, if you have questions about market entry in the US, if you want us to do your market research, or if you are looking for new business leads, you can get in touch with us. We help you be your extended arm here in the market. We also do innovation and technology scouting. So if you're looking for new interesting solutions in the market, reach out to us, and we'll try to find potential partners and solutions for you. You can follow us on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter. And we also have started publishing a so-called global situation report. You find it under WKOAT/GSR. You get regular global updates on the current economic situation and prognosis with potential opportunities and chances. And last but not least, we've also started our podcast, The Sound of Business, where we present to you successful Austrian entrepreneurs, innovators here in the US, so you can learn how they, from their personal stories, how they manage to get into the markets and be successful here, and how they perceived also the different cultural challenges between Austria and the US. So thank you for your attention. Stay safe in the next few months, and we really hope to be able to see you and welcome you here back at our office in New York City. Thank you for your attention.